In my few minutes with you, I'd like to spend some time talking about the world as it was before 9/11 and the world as it is now. I know that, like you, I have heard many, many times how the world has changed. The world is different now after September 11th. And, racial profiling is one of the ways that we can see that difference. Before September 11th, 60% of all Americans, black, white, yellow, brown, everyone, 60% were telling public opinion surveys that racial profiling was wrong, that they understood what it was, and it had to be ended. And that represented a significant change from what had been the case just a short time before that, where many people weren't even aware of the issue. So in just 2 or so years, 3 years, certainly profiling didn't just start then, but public awareness had built to the point that the perception had changed and the demands of the public had changed. Now, well, now we're still dealing with 60%, but that 60% is about something different. The issue has been recast. It didn't disappear like so many other domestic issues, but it has changed. Now, about 60% of all Americans, including, by the way, Latinos and African Americans and Asians and others who had suffered profiling, now feel that profiling is acceptable. If not a good thing, then a necessary thing, as long as we're talking about airports and Arabs, Muslims, people from the Middle East, or people who appear to be from the Middle East. Now the talk is that, look, we have to do this, don't we? And the reaction is really is understandable. Even if we don't agree with it, I think it's understandable. After all, the 19 hijackers of September 11th were all, as far as we know, all from one group of people, all Arabs, Muslims, Middle Easterners, and therefore the reasoning goes it just makes sense to focus our energy and our law enforcement resources and everything we have on that group of people so that we can prevent another disastrous terrorist attack. We all saw that attack. We know how disastrous it was. We know thousands of people died. And there's a lot of fear. And in a climate of fear, it's hard to have a rational discussion. That's what I want to do here tonight. Because I think that if we look back to what we knew about profiling, what we'd learned about profiling in the days before September 11th, if we look at those lessons carefully and try to learn them, we will see that there is a real strong reason not to repeat the same mistakes. Profiling now against possible terrorism or terrorists will be no more successful than the profiling of African Americans and other minorities on highways in the war against drugs. In fact, what is much more likely to happen is if we use racial and ethnic profiling now as a tool in our anti-terrorist arsenal, our anti-terrorism efforts will be blunted, will be thwarted, and we're actually going to end up less safe than we would otherwise. So that's what I want to do over the next few minutes with you. So let me take us back to where we were before that day, what we had learned about profiling, what we knew then, and what it might teach us now. So, the September 11th attacks were not the first time that the debate about racial profiling had changed. I've been writing and talking about profiling for some number of years. And when I first started to do that, I basically got straight up denial. It just didn't happen. And this was law enforcement audiences, and I talk to a lot of law enforcement audiences. I do a lot of law enforcement training. And they would deny it, but they were not the only ones. The members of the public denied it too. This can't be right. You're just trying to stir up racial tension. You're an apologist for people who just want excuses for their own criminal behavior. That's what's really going on. These folks are criminals, and they're just looking for an excuse to avoid the consequences of their own actions. And when I would tell stories about what had happened to African Americans or Latinos, and I talked about my research in which people had told me these stories, they were dismissed as just stories, just anecdotes. That doesn't prove anything. And this changed. It changed in a very significant way. Now, there are still people today who will tell you there's no racial profiling, there's no such thing, it's a myth, we don't do it, whatever. And some people will probably never be convinced. But there was a great change in the public debate about the mid-late 1990s, because that was the point at which the first sets of data on profiling behavior, on police behavior on the highways, came out and was made public. And it came from New Jersey, which I'm sure you've heard about, and Maryland, these two states. And that data showed, without going into any detail, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the stories were not just stories. The stories were the clearest manifestations of what was a real, a measurable, an observable phenomenon, that when we got the tools in place to measure and we were allowed to measure it, it showed up. And boy, did it ever show up. For instance, in Maryland, on the highways there patrolled by the Maryland State Police, the driving population on those highways was roughly 17% black. The population of those stopped and searched, however, was 70% black. 17 versus 70. Quite a contrast. Similar figures in New Jersey. And the availability of this information really did cause a shift in the debate. And now the debate moved from "it doesn't happen" to an explanation or a justification. People began to respond this way. Well, okay, maybe the police do target by race or ethnic appearance. Maybe they do that, but there's a good reason for it. And the reason is not race, it's not racism, it's crime fighting. This is a crime fighting tactic. That's what it's about. This is about catching bad guys. This is about taking guns off the street and drugs especially off the street. And this became, and in many ways still is, the prevailing justification for profiling, that it is an effective anti-crime tool. And it takes a form like this. Frequently I'll hear something along these lines. We're out there, we the police. We know who gets arrested. We know who's incarcerated. We know who's doing these crimes. And those people, like it or not, are predominantly African Americans, Latinos, and other minorities. Those groups are vastly overrepresented among those arrested, among those incarcerated in our prisons, and by a lot. The figures for 1998-99 are something like this. For every 100,000 African Americans, over 2,100 are incarcerated. For Hispanics, over 800 per 100,000, but for whites, only 300. Therefore, it stands to reason, the thinking goes, the explanation goes, it just makes sense. It's only rational to focus our law enforcement efforts using race or ethnic appearance as the primary lens, because that's where the bad guys are. That's how we'll catch more bad guys. And that's why this is an effective, successful crime-fighting tool. And, that's an argument that persuades a lot of people. It really does. And I think if there's an original contribution in my book, it is to take that argument on, take it on straight away, at face value, and ask, is that true? For years, people have just kind of bought this. This justification has just kind of seemed very obvious to everybody. And of course, within law enforcement, all the more so. It has become sort of the received wisdom, the folklore of the station house, in which we all believe that is handed down generation to generation from veteran to rookie, without question. And it's really time to question this assumption, to ask ourselves, does it in fact work? Is this the right way to do policing? Because as we have learned with so many other things over time, oftentimes the obvious answer doesn't turn out to be right. Now, just for purposes of our discussion here tonight, I'd like us to lay aside a very important set of issues. And that's the whole issue of the costs of this set of practices, the costs of profiling. And those costs are enormous. Of course, when we think of maybe the cost of profiling, the thing that comes to our minds is the cost to the individual people who get stopped and who are angered and who are humiliated and who are embarrassed by this, and it happens repeatedly to them. And that surely is a cost, an important cost. But it's far from the only cost. You see, this is so common. I didn't, in all my research, all the conversations I had with people, the interviews I did with them, I've yet to meet an African-American man or Latino man who can't tell me a personal story about this happening to them. Women too. And if it's not them, it's a friend or father or brother, somebody like that. And it really is a strikingly universal characteristic of black life and Latino life and Asian life in this country. It happens to everyone. And when that is the case, it isn't just an individual cost. It is a cost that is spread across an entire group. And that not only carries with it a stigma, but it becomes a kind of communal resentment. And that doesn't stay within the group either. It leaks and leaches into society. And what happens is we get this kind of building river, stream upon stream. It becomes a river of resentment. And that river flows down into all of our civic life. And the trust that we have in police officers and policing breaks down. The trust that we have in our government institutions and in our civic life breaks down. The trust that we have in the law and in the courts and in all our institutions of government all begins to be corroded by this resentment, by this cynicism about what police really do and what they say about it. But like I said, I want to just set that aside, all right? Let's pretend for the moment that that's not there, that there are no costs to profiling. And we can just ask the one pure question. Does this work? Does it effectively catch bad guys? And that's the justification, all right? So if there are no costs, does it work? Okay? So let's go forward with that question. Just in the last couple of years, it's become possible to answer that question, to test that assumption. Just in the last couple of years, new data have become available that allows us for the first time to look at what I call in the book hit rates, or the rates of success that police have when they do stops and searches. How often do they actually find the guns, the drugs, the people who have arrest warrants? Okay? You know, tailing back to what the justification is it true? Is it true that African Americans, Latinos, and others are disproportionately arrested? Yes, that is true. Is it true that they are in prison at higher rates? Yes, that's true too. Those are two facts. They're unpleasant facts, but they are facts. And we don't do anybody any good by running from facts or denying the facts. The problem is the interpretation put on those facts. You see, arrest rates or imprisonment rates don't measure crime. Right, this is a college campus. I bet if we had a criminologist in here, they could answer a question like this for us. What do arrest rates measure? They don't measure crime. They measure the behavior of arresting. They measure police behavior, the particular police behavior of arresting people. Now, that may seem so obvious that it doesn't bear stating, but this is what people are missing. This is why they jump from, well, we know who's arrested, to this is how we should enforce the law. Okay? What about incarceration? What about those vast differences in incarceration figures, disproportionate incarceration? Well, incarceration numbers also do not measure crime. Incarceration figures are a measure of incarceration. They're a measure of the activity of people who impose jail sentences. Judges, in some places juries, in some situations. The state legislature that makes the laws, that carry the sentences, the governor that signs them. Okay? But that's not the same thing as the rate of crime. So we cannot jump from those facts to an interpretation they do not support. The important question, therefore, is whether these tactics actually work. Okay? And now we can look, and now we can find out, because these new data make it possible to separate out the searches of each demographic group and ask what the hit rates are. And that's what I've done in the book. I've taken data from police departments from across the country, everywhere from the NYPD to the Customs Service to the North Carolina Highway Patrol, back to New Jersey, and a lot of other places. And we look at this data, and the first thing we notice is that it's very clear that in all these jurisdictions, people of color were targeted. There is no disputing this. They were targeted at very high, highly disproportionate rates to their presence on the highway or the city street. Very disproportionate rates. But then we separate out the searches and we ask ourselves about the hit rates, the success rates. Now, the stops and searches of whites are actually, obviously, done without a racial component. Okay? Why are whites stopped? They are acting suspiciously. They are stopped because police observe suspicious behavior. That is the real solid basis for good policing, observing suspicious behavior. That tells you everything about what people are up to. It's not what they look like. It's about what they do. I wish I had a dollar for every time a police officer told me that in the course of my research. It's about suspicious behavior. That tells you what people are up to. All right? That's why whites get stopped. Blacks and Latinos, on the other hand, they may have been behaving suspicious in some particular way, but race was the driving force behind those very high disproportionate stops in every one of these jurisdictions. Race was the thing that got people picked out, stopped, and searched. So there was targeting going on. So what was the rate of success for these searches? Let me tell you, give you a couple of examples. The NYPD is a good place to start. You know, famous for reducing crime in the 90s in New York. Famous for Mayor Giuliani's zero-tolerance policies. Well, in the wake of a very infamous shooting in New York of the immigrant Amadou Diallo, the guy with the wallet and the 41 shots, you remember that, the New York State Attorney General ordered a study of stop and frisk practices in New York. So this study gives us an opportunity to talk about racial targeting, not in the context of highway stops where we usually think about it, but stop and frisk, when people get stopped on a city street, put up against a wall, and patted down. Now, the New York police had, for some time, done something that many other police departments did not do. They actually kept records of each and every stop and frisk. Each one. And those records included where the stop and frisk occurred, what the police officer suspected, what made them do the stop and frisk, why the officer decided to go ahead, who the person was in terms of a physical description, which included race, and whether or not anything was ultimately found. Okay, so you had a pretty good database. And there's a lot of data, it turned out. This covered 15 months, this study, from all of 1998 and the first 3 months of 1999. The actual study was performed by two researchers from Columbia University, a very well-respected criminologist. And in fact, if you want to see the study itself, it's a very good, very readable study. You can go to the website for my book, which is profilesinjustice.com, one word, profilesinjustice.com. And you go to resources and reports and click on the report of the New York State Attorney General. It's all there, and it's quite good. But the one thing, again, we want to focus on was what was the rate of success, the hit rates. When you look at this study, the results are pretty remarkable. Maybe not what you'd expect. The hit rate, the success rate of searches for whites was 12.6%. Okay? The hit rate for blacks, remember, what are we expecting here? Better policing through racial targeting. The hit rate for blacks, 10.5%. Hit rate for Latinos, 11.3%. The bottom line is, when you use racial targeting, when you make race or ethnic appearance your chief criteria for who you decide is suspicious, the efficiency of your policing goes downward. You get fewer bad guys. You get fewer discoveries of drugs or guns. Take fewer guns off the street. So, in other words, rather than being an efficiency booster, it inhibits police efficiency. They get fewer successful searches. They do a worse job. Now, two important points. Number one, I haven't told you how many searches were involved in this study. It was 175,000 stops and frisks over 15 months. 175,000. They're busy people in New York. Right? That's a lot of stop and search activity. What that means, though, for purposes of the hit rates, is that these small, what seem like small percentage differences are actually quite significant. The difference between the white hit rate of 12.6%, the black hit rate of 10.5%, just a 2% difference, is highly significant statistically because of the large number of searches. Okay? And because of that, we look at the numbers and we say, wow, this is not, A, this is not what we expect. B, look at the difference. It's actually worse to use racial targeting and racial profiling than it is to use good old-fashioned observation-based policing, where you just look for somebody behaving suspiciously. Second example, everybody's heard about New Jersey, okay? Everybody knows that New Jersey is kind of a, if a state could be a poster child, New Jersey would be the poster child for racial profiling, and plenty has happened there. King Downing has been involved in a lot of it, and I know he'll tell you about some of that. But in New Jersey, we have figures that are very, very recent, from the year 2000. Now, one of the things that's important to know about racial profiling is it's not just being stopped in your car. It's what happens afterward. You know, let's be honest here. How many of you violate the traffic laws? Ever? Come on, put all your hands up. I know, come on. Everybody violates the traffic laws, and this has been proven through observational studies of highway driving behavior. There isn't a single person in this room who can drive who doesn't make traffic mistakes. And if, like me, I was a practicing lawyer before becoming an academic, and I spent a fair amount of time in that peculiar purgatory we call traffic court. Believe me, there's an offense for everyone. You know, our police officers had a saying, it's called the 3-block rule. There's no driver who can go 3 blocks without violating some aspect of the traffic code or the vehicle equipment code. If I drive in back here for 3 blocks, I gotcha. And it's all legal. I don't have to make anything up because nobody drives perfectly. Except maybe my dear old dad, and he drives too slow for conditions. Right? So there's one for everyone. Now, what happens after the stop, though, is crucial. Because you might say to yourself, okay, I was speeding. I can't say I wasn't doing the offense. But why then does the officer ask to search my car? Why does he ask to search? What does that have to do with speeding? What does that have to do with a cracked taillight? Why does he want to look in my trunk? Well, obviously, it has nothing to do with that. It's about using traffic offenses as an excuse or a pretext to investigate other things, where the Constitution wouldn't allow it. The Supreme Court has made very clear that the police have the power to search you as long as you give permission or consent. As long as that consent is voluntary, they don't have to have probable cause, reasonable suspicion. They don't need no stinking badges. You know? They can just do it if you give permission. So consent searches are one of the prime tools used along with profiling. Profiling tells the police who to regard as suspicious, and consent searches gets them into the cars and allows them to search cars. The particular data I want to show you on New Jersey is about consent searches. Consent searches were used heavily in New Jersey, as in many other states. And because consent searches are a completely discretionary matter and the officer needs no evidence at all and just can use intuition, gut instinct, anything, color, to decide who to ask for permission to search, it's a really sharp measure of how they exercise their discretion. And so it's worth asking, who gets asked? And the New Jersey data give us that, and they give us the hit rates. So here's what I want to show you. Now looky here. Who gets asked? Blacks are 53% of consent searches. Over half. And they aren't half of the driving population, not even close. More like 13% of the driving population. Hispanics, 25% of all consent searches. And whites, 19%. Who do police regard as suspicious? It's obvious, okay? But look what happens. What are the results? What are the hit rates? This is where it gets weird. They get more hits on whites than anybody. And by a factor of 2 over blacks. Okay? Blacks, 13% hit rate. Hispanics, only 5%. 1/5 the hit rate of whites. Okay? So you tell me, does racial profiling work? Is this a good policy? Is this a good way to enforce the law? Are we getting more bad guys as we concentrate our efforts on people of color? More return for the law enforcement buck, right? No. Final example. Every year the United States government does a survey called the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's one of the prime sources of real numbers on the crime rate. They talk to thousands of people, tens of thousands of people every year. They ask them, what's happened to you in the last year with regard to crime? Did any of the following things happen to you? It's a far better measure of the crime rate than, say, the FBI's uniform crime reports, which rely on people who report crimes. And many crimes, even serious crimes, are underreported. Now, in 1999, the Department of Justice, which does this survey, added a component to it. Instead of just asking about what offenses you might have experienced, they asked about contacts that the public had with police. It was called the Police Public Contact Survey. And what they learned was that 4 in 10 black males between the ages of 18 and 35 had had a number of encounters with police in the prior 12 months that they considered to be based upon their race, in which they were, your taillight lens is cracked, can I search your car, that sort of thing. 4 in 10. A smaller but still significant percentage had had as many as 10 such contacts in 12 months. Okay, so again, we know who gets targeted. And then the question was asked, did the police find anything when you had your encounter with them? Okay? Here are the results. Huh? Hit rate for whites, twice the hit rate for blacks. Hit rate for Hispanics, 10%. Is this good policing? Are we doing a better job when we target this population? What happens when you use color is that policing is slowed down, pulled down, made less effective, does a worse job of fighting and uncovering crime. It's incontrovertible. Now, why has this persisted? Interesting question. I think simply people believe the opposite. They have accepted it for so long and not questioned it. There's never been a way to test it. That it is one of those ingrained beliefs we are loath to give up. Perhaps now we can rethink this. Perhaps now we can discuss it. Because it surely does not seem to be a productive tactic. And remember, we were just putting aside the question of costs. Okay? If we talk about costs, here's how it's going to go. Let's see, we have this tactic, and it imposes enormous social costs, not just on the people stopped, but on all of society, and it doesn't work. Good choice? I don't think so. I don't think so. Well, so now we come to September 11th. Now our discussion changes. Now the people in the crosshairs are Middle Easterners, Muslims and Arabs. So now, again, we find the same kind of arguments being made. It simply makes sense to go ahead and do this. Let me read to you a very, very small excerpt from a column that appeared in September. This is by syndicated columnist Kathleen Parker. And Ms. Parker says the following. When a police officer apprehends and searches an African American only because he's black, assuming no other mitigating factors, that's unjustified racial profiling. When an airport security guard searches a male of Middle Eastern extraction following an historical terrorist attack by males of Middle Eastern extraction, that's common sense. A terrorist attack of such enormous proportions followed by a declaration of war makes racial profiling a temporary necessity that no patriotic American should protest. Pretty strong words. Well, it's a strong time. This is where we are. This is where people's heads are. And that's why I want to spend my last few minutes with you talking about this. What about this? Isn't profiling not only inevitable now, but desirable? And my answer would be no, no, and no. Here's why. Number one, if policing, good policing, is about the observation of suspicious behavior, observing what people are doing closely so that you know what they're going to do next. When you shift and when you factor in race, what happens is you take your eye off the ball. You move from looking at what's important, which is behavior, to looking at what is literally skin deep. Right? You take your eye off what's important and put it on something that matters a lot less and that predicts hardly at all. You know, race is a perfectly good thing to be used in policing if it's used right. It's a good way to describe people. You have a known suspect, so-and-so robbed a bank. He's described as 5'10", 190 pounds, white, wearing a this, and having a mustache. It's fine to say the person is white or black or Asian because that is a physical characteristic of a known person or a person who's been observed. And it can't change. It's actually a better description than the clothing because the clothing can easily be shed and changed. But race is a poor predictor. So if we use race to try to predict what people are going to do, we lose. Second point is related. And that is that if we use race to sort of construct our suspect pool, if we use race and ethnic appearance, even as only one criteria among many to decide who is suspicious and who is not, what happens is our suspect pool is much larger than it would be if it was just about behavior. And we end up having to check out all these extra people. And not even Attorney General Ashcroft's FBI has unlimited manpower. Now maybe we should thank our stars for that. But they couldn't do it even if they wanted to. And when we enlarge the suspect pool, we simply spread our resources out much thinner. And that makes no sense. Third point, if observation of suspicious behavior is key, certainly another key factor is intelligence. Intelligence gathering and the use of intelligence. We've heard, I know all of us have heard in the time since September 11th, many times, that September 11th, it shows a massive failure of the intelligence apparatus of the United States. Right? Now, if we want intelligence and information on the Al-Qaeda sleeper cells we hear about, or the people who are allegedly inside our country ready to do us harm, where are we going to get it? Where is the most likely place? Who are the most likely people to encounter those folks on any kind of daily or consistent basis? It will be the other people in the Middle Eastern communities. If we want to have a chance of getting information about a person who doesn't look right, doesn't fit in, is doing something odd, it can't come from the white people next door, like the anecdote I heard yesterday where the police got a report of a suspiciously behaving Arab and he's changing his license plates and the police roll up to his house. Well, it turns out he's putting a new bracket around his license plate. You know, I'd rather be sailing or something. Right? We don't need that kind of intelligence. We need the kind of intelligence you can get only from a community. Now, you will not get that unless you have a good partnership and real trust with that community. You simply won't get that. And I can give you a perfect recipe for destroying trust with your communities. You announce that you're going to interview 5,000 of them. And they have no connection to the terrorist attack. Oh, it's all voluntary. Oh, and you know, as you go out, FBI agents that do these interviews, you might want to check their immigration status. Maybe you can lock them up. You know? This is a great way to destroy trust and a wonderful way to bring fear into it. And people simply don't come forward when they're afraid. When they're afraid they're going to jeopardize themselves or a relative or a friend and they're being asked for addresses of people they know. I mean, if you want to screw up your possibility of getting intelligence, that is the way to do it. Last point on this. We don't want to underestimate our enemies. Al-Qaeda is a formidable foe. Not just because they're willing to kill us and die in the trying. Not just because they're vicious, but because they're smart. And they're very, very adaptable. You know, the attacks on September 11th on the World Trade Center were not the first attacks on the World Trade Center. They were the second attacks. The first attacks were in 1993. And they were carried out with truck bombs. And when that did not bring the buildings down or kill a sufficient number of people, and we hardened our buildings and landmarks against truck bombs with these enormous planters that you see everywhere now, the big cement things, what did they do? They went back, they bided their time, they devised a new, deadlier plan, they practiced it, and they carried it out to perfection, deadly perfection. These people change tactics. They react. They look for new weaknesses. We're not going to have any suicide hijackings anymore. I mean, you know, when somebody gets up to get another drink, the other passengers leap up and, you know, hit them with axes and tie them up and everything. Yeah, they're not going to do that. And they're not going to send young Arab men to do the job either. Right? Because they know who we're looking for. How do they know? Well, we're doing everything but putting it up on billboards in Times Square. We're telling them by what we're doing, by the 5,000 being questioned and the 6,000 being targeted for visa violations. Not that they're not violating their visas, but there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country violating their visas, and we're not going after them. Just these 6,000. So what are they going to do? They're going to send people who don't look like that and are not from there and don't have Arabic surnames. You know, lots of people went to those camps in Afghanistan. People from Ireland, people from the Scandinavian countries, from Germany. Who did they send to attack an airliner after 9/11? It was not Middle Eastern. It was not an Arab. It was not from Syria or Lebanon or any of those places. He was a British citizen with a valid passport, and his surname was not anything. It was Reed. Okay? The shoe bomber. I mean, if it's that simple to defeat our profiling system, I mean, profiling is not going to make us safer. Profiling will simply move the danger to something else and give us a false sense of security. And that is really dangerous. I mean, the way that airliners are going to be attacked now is probably through sneaking explosives on in luggage of unsuspecting passengers, of people who get on the plane themselves. And the government has announced that it can't possibly screen all the bags, can't possibly screen all the packages for explosives. There's no way they could meet the January 18 deadline. That's why these random searches in airports that people are all so hot about now are actually very good. They stand to actually make us safer. But of course, we, who don't look like Muhammad Atta, we don't want to put up with that. You know, why should we put up with that? We don't look like that. It's not that simple. So I want to end my remarks by just saying this. You know, it's a time of great fear, and we're being asked to sacrifice, give up some of our liberties for increased security. How many times have you heard that? I'd like you to ask two questions. It's very easy to give up our liberties when we give up somebody else's liberties. You know? Who's really being asked to sacrifice? And second, are we actually going to be any safer with the sacrifice being asked of us? Profiling won't do it. Profiling is an empty promise. And we need more. We have to have a safe air travel system, but we need more a government that is accountable, reasonable, respectful, and effective in its actions. We are owed that. Thank you.